Today we are here to discuss about the startup opportunities between India and Southeast Asia. So we all know that Silicon Valley is certainly the mecca for tech startups, but within the past few years we have seen a lot of entrepreneurs moving to Asia due to large size of the market and ease of doing business. The success stories of Flipkart in India and Grab Taxi in Southeast Asia have proved that both the regions are ripe for growth. To learn more about the startup opportunities between India and Southeast Asia, we have an esteemed panel of highly experienced people doing businesses both in India and Southeast Asia. So thank you so much for coming here, and it'll be great if you can, give a brief introduction about yourself. So Manik can start.
Can you hear me? Manik Arora, I'm founder and MD of IDG Ventures. IDG Ventures is a global venture capital organization. We manage around 3.5 billion globally, primarily in China. In India, we manage a little bit over 250 million, doing investments typically between 1 to 10 million. Our sectors are internet, mobile software, and healthcare broadly. My background, I'm an ex-kind of BCG consultant who worked in operating companies for several years, founded a startup, and then worked in the Valley at Battery Ventures before coming out to India to start IDG around 8 years ago.
Yeah, Amit. Yeah.
Thanks, Rishi. My name is Amit Somani, and I'm a managing partner at a seed stage VC firm called Angel Prime. We typically do tech product-driven companies, about a seed investment about $500,000 to $1 million. And my background is largely in technology and product with companies like MakeMyTrip, Google, and IBM in the US. So, what do you?
So, Roshni, yeah.
Hi, I'm Roshni. So I run Tickled Media, which is the publisher of The Asian Parent, which is Southeast Asia's largest parenting network. So we have presence in across Southeast Asia, in Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, and we just entered into the India market in the beginning of this year.
Shobit.
Hi, my name is Shobit. I manage the overall global business for AdNear, which is a location intelligence platform. What it basically means is that it mines location data from over 700 million devices globally and profiles users based on that, and it can be used for advertising, marketing, content personalization, etc. Thank you.
Okay. So, Roshni and Shobit, can you share your journey of how did you, move from India to Southeast Asia and vice versa? Because Roshni can tell us more about how she moved to India, and Shobit can tell us more about how he moved to Southeast Asia from India.
Shobit, you want to start?
Okay. So, prior to AdNear, I was with another mobile advertising company called InMobi, and the one thing that's common between both companies is that they were started from India, from Bangalore, and then eventually, because they were in the B2B space, they realized that there was a massive opportunity internationally, and they moved their headquarters to Singapore. Why we did that? Obviously, Singapore is a great vantage point to expand not just into Southeast Asia, but other markets like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, China, and Korea. One of the obviously big challenges that we faced, and both the times you underestimated to an extent, was the coming from India, you feel that you know what diversity means, but it stretches to another level when you launch in Southeast Asia, where there are a dozen markets, extremely complex in the way business is done, culturally very, very different. Singapore is obviously easy to do business in, but when you try to expand your business into multiple different geographies within Southeast Asia, it's extremely challenging. And fundraising is one challenge. The other challenge is hiring people. And while I envy startups, especially in the B2C space in India, which pay huge amounts of money and hire amazingly talented people in India, we find, and probably Roshni can talk more about it, we find it extremely hard to recruit talent for startups in markets like Indonesia, where the risk appetite for young, probably college graduates who are looking out for jobs is not the same as it is in India and China. And I guess hopefully it will change in the next 3 to 5 years, but right now it's still fairly low. So that's one of the biggest challenges that we've faced.
Yeah. Roshni, tell us about how you expanded to India.
Okay, so before I tell you guys my story, I just want to understand how many here in the audience have businesses in India? Could you just put a show of hands? Okay. And how many of you guys plan to enter into the India market? Okay. And for those of you who plan to enter into the India market, would you say predominantly your business is here in Singapore? If it's a yes, just you can put up your hands. Okay, great, thanks. So my story is a little interesting. I set up my first business 5 years ago, Tickled Media in Singapore. And I knew that I wanted to enter into the India market at some point, but I wasn't too sure when. So I decided, okay, let's try Thailand next because it's slightly bigger than Singapore, but it's still a pretty controlled market. So I entered into Thailand. And then I decided, okay, I nailed Thailand. We were number one in Singapore for the mom market. We were number one in Thailand for the mom market. So to give you an indication, in Singapore, we have 90% of the moms using us on a monthly basis. In Thailand, it was about 60 to 65%. So then we decided we wanted to go into a slightly bigger market, so we chose Philippines. Philippines has a population of about 100 million. And then we went into Indonesia, which is again, bigger than Philippines. And then, of course, finally we felt like the team knew what it was doing and it was ready to take on the big dragon, right, which is India. So we entered into the India market in the beginning of this year, and there were a lot of questions from the team as well as from my investors and just myself. Which part of India do you enter into? Is it Bangalore? Is it Mumbai? Is it Delhi? And for me, the last time I had been to India was more than 10 years ago. So I was completely clueless. So I decided to take, after I raised VC funding, which I did earlier in this year with Vertex, who were very bullish about me entering into the India market, I just packed up my bag for 2 weeks and I said, okay, I'm going to go to Mumbai, I'm going to go to Delhi, and I'm going to go to Bangalore, and I'm going to just suss it out. So I started LinkedIn. I got on LinkedIn. I connected with all the top entrepreneurs from each one of these cities and told them, hey, I'm coming into India. Can I buy you coffee? Can I buy you a drink? Can I buy you whiskey? Tell me about the ecosystem and just share with me what you know. So I went to Delhi first. I met with a few of the startups there. I met with Ixigo. I met with quite a number of the players there. And they really opened up everything about how much it costs to run a company, how much they're paying in salaries. And then I took a trip down to Bangalore, and then I did it in Mumbai. And finally I decided that Mumbai was it for me.
Okay. Why did you choose Mumbai over the other places in India?
So there were a few factors. First of all, most of my team, they're very international. We've got people from all walks of life and all colors and, of course, different genders as well. And I felt that Mumbai was the most cosmopolitan out of the three of them. So the team would actually enjoy coming up to India to work with the rest of the team. Mumbai is also the most English-speaking besides Bangalore, Mumbai is pretty English-speaking. Delhi is not as English-speaking. And then, of course, we're a lot of women as well. And in Mumbai, out of the three, is definitely the safest city.
Yeah. I agree with it. So, now Amit and Manik can probably tell us about what do you think about investing in India and Southeast Asia?
That's a very broad question. Truth be told, we don't have much experience in investing in Southeast Asia, so perhaps some of my assumptions could be incorrect. I think in India, when we decided our investment strategy, when I was doing VC in the Valley, so there it's fairly sophisticated with which sectors are kind of going through a growth curve, what's the thing we want, what's this guy's background, has he built companies before? And I think when we came to India, what I realized, is you can have strategies, but at least at that stage, the amount of management talent that was available that had entrepreneurial experiences before, and also teams that were assembled where you felt like they did have complementary strengths, they were few and far between. And so, we actually ended up just backing people we thought that could build big businesses and didn't have too much of a strategy approach. I think that's evolved a lot in India. And perhaps Southeast Asia will go through that too, which is now that you have so many people that have experience working at startups, management talent is less of a constraint, particularly in the last 2-3 years than it used to be. If you look at the history of India's investment cycles, 99 was the first investment cycle, and that crashed in 2001 around the rest of the world. So you had all these startup CEOs who were funded, and then they couldn't get their Series B, and they all went back to get their jobs. So nobody really got trained, other than the IT services guys, on how to build large companies. And I think that has a direct effect on the VC returns. Come 2005, a bunch of VC funds got created, ours being one of them. And I think that process has now resulted in a few companies exiting, several companies becoming big. I mean, we're fortunate. We were part of Myntra. We were part of Flipkart. And just Flipkart alone, you're already seeing in the last year or so a number of guys coming out, starting interesting businesses. So I think our strategy has changed in India now, and it's much more strategy-oriented as opposed to team-oriented because there are many good teams. And so we do a lot of digital consumer investing because of all the data everybody knows in internet and mobile going through the roof. And most of our money has been made there. Enterprise, we do a little less of. And I would generally say to anyone who's got a SaaS or enterprise license business in the in Singapore, thinking of going to India, think very carefully because it's very hard to make money in enterprise in India. 9 out of 10 times I would not do it. On the other hand, if I was a company that had a digital consumer play like Roshni's company, for example, which is content and community, India is a massive opportunity. You should definitely go after that. So I think our strategy evolved, and now we're much more sector and strategy oriented. Teams are, as long as you've got a good CEO, even if there's a number 2 but not a 3, 4, 5, we're very happy to help build that. I think if you look about where the biggest money will be made in India over the next 10 years, and you just say, if you had to pick sectors, it's pretty likely to be consumer. Just generally, anything to do with the consumer. And if you look, we have a pretty massive franchise in IDG China. The bulk of our returns all came from digital consumer companies. Baidu, Tencent, these are large companies. But even if you look at the long tail of returns of companies that made 7, 8, 10x, they're all consumer companies. Very few enterprise companies actually did it. The enterprise companies that have succeeded out of India are actually the ones that managed to transition to the US very early on, like a co-founder moved out to the US. So that would just be a very broad input that India is a digital consumer market. Enterprise is happening, but I think it's the funds that help them go to the US quickly. Those are the big hit companies. I think similarly for Southeast Asia, if I was in Singapore, I think Roshni's done it very intelligently. I would go for the Indonesia, Philippines probably seems like 2 markets, at least from what I've read, would be the digital consumer markets. On the enterprise side, it's debatable that whether you should go into Southeast Asia at all. There's enough kind of large enterprise customers sitting in Singapore and Singapore Inc. And I think the government has done a phenomenal job, particularly recently with fintech, to create that. So if I was an enterprise player in Southeast Asia, I would not go to India, I would go to the US, and I would see how much money you can get from Singapore Inc. To showcase your products. So those are kind of just broad observations in terms of sectors. I think in terms of us investing in Southeast Asia, we're not doing that. We don't plan to for some time because in India there's just such a massive amount of opportunity today. So just a few thoughts.
Okay. Amit, can you tell us about your thoughts?
Sure. I think Manik probably covered most of it, but let me take 3 specific sectors and talk a little bit about that. So we do a lot of stuff around fintech and payments, financial services, stuff like that. That seems to have very interesting opportunities, both from India going to Southeast Asia and possibly vice versa, even though there's obviously some regulatory and other sort of on-the-ground issues. In general, like Manik said, on the consumer internet side, and I would sort of broaden that a little bit to say where you have digital distribution, where you don't necessarily need feet on street. So for example, there's probably a ton of gaming companies, right, in markets like Southeast Asia, perhaps Indonesia, Philippines, and so forth. India is a fantastic market, right? Up until now, we've only had, maybe 18 months ago, we had 25, 30 million monthly active users. Now there's about 150 to 200 million monthly active users, right? And there's very little local gaming that's there, and some of these simple casual games and so on that can transcend boundaries. So I think there's opportunity for more digital-oriented plays. So that's another one I would pick. And the last one I'll talk a little bit about is travel. I used to be the chief product officer at MakeMyTrip, which was India's largest travel company, is India's largest travel company. And I remember when we at MakeMyTrip wanted to expand to Southeast Asia and other parts of Europe, and this is post-IPO, we went on an acquisition spree and we actually bought about 5 companies in Southeast Asia. So while that's probably not necessarily the best outcome for any entrepreneur, but getting an exit is better than not, right? So you could also partner with companies that are doing really well in India and intending to kind of expand abroad, right? So while the Flipkarts and the Ola Cabs of the world probably have enough and more to do there. There are lots of companies that are looking to expand into other markets. In what we used to call Greater India, which is about a 5-hour flying radius out of India. So I see a lot of M&A opportunities happening and partnership opportunities happening in those areas. So I'd say investment focus-wise, pretty much like Manik, we're very focused largely on India alone and nothing else really at the moment. But I think it's a huge market, and if you are here, I would, even though I really like what Roshni said, I think it could be an interesting market if you're a Southeast Asia-based company wanting to do something with more digital distribution in India. I think timing is better than ever before.
Appreciate it. I don't want to make it, while we're not investing in Southeast Asia, we are, as we do with our companies, for any region, we're looking at how we can expand some of our kind of digital consumer companies, particularly on the mobile side, into Southeast Asia. I sit on this board of a company called vServe, which Shobit would know well because they're also in the mobile mobile data and advertising space. It's interesting, when we invested in that company, we were trying to make it a leader for mobile advertising for India, and while it did become that for this particular segment that it's in, today around 35 to 40% of its revenue comes from Southeast Asia, primarily from India, Philippines, and Singapore. So we're very kind of open to the extent any people in the audience want to look through our portfolio and see if there are partnership opportunities. We'd love to facilitate that.
Which regions do you think? Okay, you were saying something.
Just to add to what Manik and Amit said, if you look at the way the investment climate grew in China around 2010, 2011, 2012, it was just going crazy, and obviously IDG was one of the funds, and there were a bunch of other investors who were really investing a lot in consumer internet. India's probably started seeing that 12, 18 months back, and it's going through that inflection point right now. I think we would not be very surprised if markets like Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia go through that inflection point in the next 12 to 18 months, and we are already seeing some very large investments going from SoftBank and a few other investors into Tokopedia, etc. We're seeing about $50, $100 million investments starting to be made. I think that cycle is going to happen in the next 12 to 18 months in Southeast Asia, and when that happens, we'll start seeing a lot of, so you can just look at China and India, and you can almost, to an extent, you can predict safely as to what's going to happen in the ecosystem from an investment standpoint, from a jobs creation standpoint, and how the risk appetite for the younger generation is going to change, especially with the emerging sectors like mobile, big data, etc.
Okay, so what are the cultural differences that you faced when you expanded your team to India and Southeast Asia? So, Roshni, you can tell us about India. What are the cultural differences you faced?
So each market in Southeast Asia and India, of course, they're so different, and culturally they're really different as well. So we do daily stand-ups across all countries every morning. And in Singapore, sometimes we have to bribe people to speak more than just 1 or 2 sentences. Whereas that's not the case in India. In India, you have to actually give them a time limit. Like, hello, it's 60 seconds already. Next person, time's up. So Indians communicate a lot. In India as well, you'll notice that everyone's sort of they're not really afraid to help out or voice out or give in their suggestion as well. They're a lot more willing to contribute in that sense. In the other Southeast Asian countries, I think you need to first build the culture of trust. I think in Southeast Asia as well, a lot of times they feel you don't question the boss. When the boss comes in and the boss asks something, you just do it. Whereas in India, especially among the younger generation, I think there's a lot of a culture of dissent, which is a good thing for startups. So that's a major thing that I've noticed different between these countries. The other thing is that one thing that I noticed in the Philippines as well was that everyone we employed actually preferred to report to a woman versus a guy, especially the engineers, male engineers as well. And they felt because a lot of times they're very, they don't like to talk about their displeasure, and women sometimes probe like what's wrong. There's something about the women's instinct or intuition. So so you probe people even when they say no, nothing's wrong. You still go, no, I know something's wrong. Why don't you talk to me? And they actually enjoy that because over time they start opening up and they start sharing more of their worries and feedback. And they don't do that with another guy. So that was another interesting thing I found out, that in Philippines they're very comfortable reporting to women.
Okay. So Shobit, you tell us about.
Actually, the interesting thing about Southeast Asia is that it's almost like a microcosm of what Asia in general is. The Pacific region is like. You have markets like Singapore with sub 120% mobile penetration, and then you have markets like Vietnam, which are also large, but they bring very different level of complexity. So highly developed economies, developing economies, small markets, sub 4-5 million people, large markets with 100, 150 million, 250 million people in Indonesia. Culturally, they are very different. Indonesia, one of the earliest lessons, I think a lot of, especially, people from outside Indonesia, when they go and do business there, and there are a lot of expats in Indonesia, they realize is that you just can't push too hard. Things happen at their own pace. They happen at a certain level of comfort, and if you try to push, things will break. So you need to, let things happen at their own pace. Vietnam it presents its own level of challenges. It's very similar to China in certain ways, although as countries they're very different and on polar opposites. But in a lot of ways, in terms of the way business happens, the way you have to crack a deal with some of the large enterprise, it brings its own set of complexities. Singapore obviously is very methodical. Things flow in a certain way. There's a workflow that you need to follow, and things will get done. And I think from a business standpoint, being in an enterprise or a B2B business, we've realized that, and I think the kind of business that, let's say, Roshni is running, which is more B2C, if you want to monetize your properties in a market like Indonesia or Thailand or Philippines, or even if you want to sell to large enterprise clients, you need to have a local presence, be it you hiring local people who can work with local clients, or you find and identify the right partners in each market. Because if a lot of companies, sitting in Singapore, if you want to do, you can do regional deals. You can get a mandate from a large client in Singapore for the region, but at the end of the day, you'll have to go and meet their folks in Indonesia or Philippines or Thailand, and for that you'll probably need some sort of a local presence. And that's one of the challenges that you face in a market like Southeast Asia, where probably 5-6 markets, you need to have a sort of a strategy and a presence for each of them, and they're all very different.
To add to that, while we might have the comfort to hire people who are similar to us, but that doesn't necessarily work across the Southeast Asian market. In Thailand, for example, I have a lot of members of my team who don't even speak a word of English. And we need that because we realize that the moment we change from having a quasi-expat / overseas educated Thai team versus having a very local Thai team, the company actually did much better with in terms of revenue, in terms of growth, traffic, media coverage, when we had a purely local Thai team. And we saw the same thing in Indonesia as well.
Okay. So, yeah, Amit, so do you think hiring a local team is more important than, having a team that can work remotely?
I can certainly speak about our Make My Trip experience, although it's a little, more an acquisition rather than sort of organically building out. So typically, like anything else, a hybrid model works quite well. So I think having a mix of, for example, we had a team in Phuket in Thailand, which is about 70 odd people. Maybe there were 15 or 20 expats, and then about 50 odd people that are sort of locally there. Some people that actually went in from Delhi, from Gurgaon, which is where Make My Trip was headquartered. So I think there isn't necessarily a one size fits all, but I would say that pretty much across all these cultures, and one has worked across. What Roshni said earlier, just over communicating often helps with, across any culture, right? Whether it's a stand-up meeting, even little things like just putting video conference equipment everywhere and spending a ton of money to do that, that made a big difference, right? So when you actually were having conversation, you could read a little bit of the body language, getting people together, getting the leadership teams together. So it's just really communicating and spending the time, and there is no shortcut, unfortunately. Kind of learn that way.
Manik, would you like to add to that?
No, and not much. I mean, other than just a kind of broad point, which is, I think, different countries, or in the case of India, you definitely see biases I may offend some people here, but I'm going to say it anyway, that you definitely do see certain cities have certain skill sets that are more pronounced. And there's a great opportunity to put people from different cities together or leverage those. And I'm sure that's true in Southeast Asia. So for example, if you're looking to go out to India, Roshni, I'm sure you went through this process and arrived in Bombay, that on average you will find the most aggressive salespeople in the north. Right, from Delhi. And you ask anybody who's been in, most aggressive guys are from the north. And then as you come further down, they become less and less aggressive. That's not true. That's not to say they're not aggressive salespeople in Bangalore. There are lots. But if you went for critical mass and general, as they say, boiling Punjabi blood, it's all, in the north, right? And then if you kind of look at, if you want to, get people who are really good at kind of building good products, very good engineering and R&D skills, on average, those would be in Bangalore, or Chennai perhaps on the enterprise side, and also, I think to some extent Gurgaon also in the last few years. So I think similarly, as you build India operations and you think these three things, that if you're for example, if you're Facebook and you're coming into India, actually you don't need to hire a single person to do your business model, and you could hire a bunch of people to do advertising, sales, etc. But so depending on your business model, I think you can pick the city. I think the same is probably true for Southeast Asia. And I don't know the nuances of the countries, but I think Singapore is incredibly well positioned to build those kind of hybrid teams that take the best of different skills from the Philippines or Indonesia or India and build those kind of world-class companies. I'm a real big believer in that because I grew up in Singapore and I've been coming here every few years, and I can definitely see that piece coming together. And Singapore is unique in that it actually has a cultural melting pot element that you could actually do that.
Okay. So
It just costs a lot of money, Manik. So if you guys can invest in stuff, so you can keep hiring people in Singapore.
Well, Roshni was saying that, and it's, like in Indonesia, there are a lot of guys there who are actually from India, who are leading operations, and and I think Roshni and Twishy were both agreeing earlier that sometimes the best way to hire is actually be a global company and get the Indian companies to be attracted to get these foreign trips to Southeast Asia while they stay in India and they want to keep working for you.
yeah. So I would like to take questions from the audience now. So one of the interesting questions is that what are the major challenges in terms of performing due diligence on startups in India if you're a foreign investor? Yeah. So Manik. Okay.
So I think it depends on the kind of stage of company, obviously. So at a seed stage, largely you have literally the team and the broad market to go by. There's, maybe an early prototype. That's typically the stage we invest in. So we end up spending a lot of time, obviously, with the entrepreneurs, but also doing a lot of reference checking, right? And it's while it's becoming a big market, it's a small ecosystem. So pretty much even between us, we found connections that we didn't know until we got on the panel. So a lot of obviously I need to spend a lot of time with the entrepreneurs and sort of reference checking. Maybe Manik can speak a little bit more on the later stage stuff. But now, at least on the more digital-oriented businesses, there's a lot of data that's around and accessible, right? Whether you're using, Omniture or Flurry or Google Analytics or whatever. So oftentimes, again, at seed, it's less relevant because they've probably just launched or they're just about to launch. But in the later stages, when some of our companies get there, the investors will actually get down to that level, post, maybe very close to a term sheet or just after. So I think maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
I'd agree with them. I don't think it's that challenging to due diligence in India, but I think the key is as a foreign investor, yes, then it's hard if you don't have on-the-ground presence. So, just the way we diligence typically is, we diligence two criteria, market and team, which is it a good market? Is there less competition? Can this differentiated proposition win? And then we spend a ton of time on the team, especially if we also do a little seed, but on early, on the people. And beyond that, I think after you've kind of done that piece for Series A investing, that's bulk of the bet. There's usually not much revenue to analyze. If there's revenue to analyze in Series B, then we're even happier. Then we ask all kinds of irritating questions about everything. But if it's a Series A investment, I think that's it. The financial and legal diligence and all that is pretty well structured in India. I mean, I think 7-8 years ago, VCs, especially foreign VCs, had to actually teach the industry at some level. But today, it's a very different market. But the number one thing that we reference, right, is through our networks, the people, right? And so if anybody's hiring anybody, make my trip, here's your man.
Okay. So the second question is, what's the best and the worst thing about expanding to India? What's the best and what's the worst thing?
I'll take the best, that's easy. Big market.
Rushing it.
So I'm not sure if the big market thing is as sexy as it's made out to be. India does have the internet penetration in India is not as high. Like for example, in Singapore, you're saying 95% or so of people are connected on the internet. So the market is big, but the market is not necessarily on the internet, and the numbers are also a little bit sketchy in the sense of, you have to really dig deep and see how many of them are genuine internet users, how many of them are actually logging on a daily basis, and it's not just, oh, I checked my email once to see a picture that my granddaughter sent me, users. So I would be a little worried about that. Like for us, we realized that we wanted to enter into India, even though it's a little bit premature for our industry, because we wanted to poise ourselves for the boom that we expect in a couple of years' time, when a lot of university students or newlyweds will start producing children, and they're the internet generation. The worst thing about expanding into India is, I think, the traffic. The traffic is really, 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 really bad. I think India traffic, especially in a place like Mumbai, it's worse than Indonesia. It's worse than Thailand. You've got the monsoon weather, which a lot of people don't realize, and then forget it. You're just never going to be able to get into the office if you're staying far away. I think in terms of infrastructure as well, you'd be surprised at how many times you need to use a backup power generator because internet or electricity just goes off. And I think if you're living in a country like Singapore, you just don't get used to that, or you don't even expect it. So the first time it happens, you're like, what just happened here? And then you realize it's going to happen every single day for the next 1 month from 4 to 6 p.m. Deal with it. Low internet bandwidth as well in the offices. So I think these are just some of the basic infrastructure challenges that you're going to have to deal with. In terms of traffic, the reason I say it's probably a lot worse in India than it is in the other countries is, for example, in Indonesia, you have Gojek. In Thailand, you just jump straight on the motorbike and you move between Sukhumvit or Silom and Sukhumvit. And of course, in Singapore, you have the MRTs. So I think just infrastructure problems.
Bombay, you can get on the local, which will take you fast from one place to the other.
So yeah.
But not necessarily the safest.
So do you want to add, Shobit, to this?
No, I think Manik nailed it early on when he said that, and I can tell you from a B2B perspective, if you're in a consumer business, India is definitely a market you want to be in at this point in time. But in a B2B business, you should think hard because there are bigger markets out there which you should target, and the ROI that you'll get for the effort that you'll put in is going to be probably a lot higher than what you would get from India today. Things might change, but as of today, that's what the reality is.
I'll just chime in. I think any business in India is hard to execute, B2C or B2B. It's just the rewards for B2C are much larger, so you go for it. The one thing I would say, and I never knew this as a VC until I sat on a board of a few companies, is in India, revenue and collections are two very widely different things. And I think anyone going into India, and that would be the only piece of advice I could say generically, is if you're going to have a business which has to depend in any way on revenue, which hopefully, I know these new age businesses don't, but hopefully at some point they do, you got to make sure that you have a very good understanding of the collection cycle, because it is not uncommon, particularly say in the advertising world, and I can see Shobit smiling on this one, right, that you'll have these agencies, and agencies are notorious for doing this everywhere, but in India, 130-day cycle, 140-day payment cycle, that's normal, right? And so that I think has huge ramifications as you scale up on your working capital.
So just to add to that, so in a country like Singapore, our payment cycle for advertising is about 1 month. So it's between 30 days to 60 days, and clients actually pay you promptly. In Thailand, it's also about 1 to 2 months. In Philippines and Indonesia, it's typically about 3 to 4 months. In India, it's between 6 months to a year.
So actually, I wanted to clarify one thing on the comment Roshni made. So there's at least 4 or 5 properties that have 100 million monthly active users now, right? I mean, obviously, likes of Facebook, WhatsApp, Gmail. So these are 30-day actives, not 1 year or once in a lifetime actives. And this has changed in the last 12 to 18 months. The flip side is with the amount of investor money chasing startups, especially in the consumer side, the cost of customer acquisition is pretty high, right? Because the media and some of the properties, even like our own, those businesses haven't flourished in the past, right? Because there have been a few sort of, I wouldn't necessarily say false start, but it hasn't really taken off until now. So something's really happened in the last 18 months in terms of actual digital consumption. So anyway.
Okay, so we are running out of time. So thank you so much, guys. Thank you for your insightful comments on the topic. Thank you.